Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David, and thank you very much for choosing to spend your afternoon with us. I'm the Education Officer for the Lurgan Townscape Heritage Scheme, which is a scheme which is funded by the Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It has a twin aim of regenerating a number of historic buildings within the Lurgan Town Centre, as well as carrying out an activity programme to promote understanding and enjoyment of the heritage of Lurgan. So this here is actually our first event of the year, which of course last year was rather disrupted by COVID. We're hoping this year that we'll be able to run a number of events online and in Lurgan, hopefully in the summer time. Now, some of you will be aware that over the past year we've been holding a series of talks looking at aspects of Lurgan's 17th century. And this talk will conclude that series. And it's going to really focus on a man who's really a pivotal figure in the history of Lurgan, Arthur Chamberlain Brownlow, the landlord of the town from 1666 right through to 1711. Through his enterprise and his industry and his instinct, he was really responsible for restoring the fortunes of the town after the ravages of the 1641 insurrection. And in fact, if you look at the town today, much of the layout reflects a lot of the planning and principles and ideas of Arthur Brownlow. As well as that, he was a man of considerable culture, of science, and had an interest in Irish manuscripts. He was fluent in Irish, which are things which we not necessarily associate with an Ulster Plantation landlord. This somewhat reflects his background and also provides an insight into the reality of plantation life. Things were perhaps a bit more complex than are sometimes understood. There's a lot of meat to get stuck into then, and so much so that we've had to bring with us two speakers, not just one, to get a handle on this man. I'm delighted to welcome Raymond Gillespie and Bernadette Cunningham. Raymond is the Professor of History at Maynooth University. He's written widely on Irish and history, a very familiar name to anybody involved in local or Irish history indeed. For those who are interested in Lurgan history, I would point you in the direction of his book that he edited, Settlement and Survival, on an Ulster estate, the Brownlow lease book. This provides a transcription and an analysis of Arthur Brownlow's lease book. And it's a fantastic piece of history to get really to grips with Lurgan's history in that sort of first century. Bernadette is the deputy, or Dr. Bernadette Cunningham, just to give you your proper title, is the deputy librarian at the Royal Irish Academy. She's written widely on our intellectual history in Ireland. And I think it's fair to say, Bernadette, you would be a leading authority in Irish manuscripts without wishing to embarrass you too much. Thank you very much for joining us. So if I'm going to hand over to you, Raymond, I think to start outlining the life of Arthur Brownlow. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, David. What we're going to try today to do is really to do three things, to ask three questions. First question is, who is this man, Arthur Brownlow? Or has he universally always signed himself ABC? And we'll see why ABC should have been his moniker, so to speak. So I'm going to try and address that question of who was Arthur Brownlow. And then Bernie is going to come in and she is going to try and deal with the question, well, what are these Irish manuscripts that Arthur Brownlow collected? And then I'm going to come back and try to offer you an explanation as to why this man collected Irish manuscripts. In a way, to try and make the first two halves of the talk meld together by asking the who and the what, try to get the why. So let's begin then with this man, Arthur Brownlow. Who is Arthur Brownlow? Why is he important? Why is he interesting? After all, I mean, he's not somebody who makes a big splash in Irish history. He was an MP in the Irish parliaments of the 1690s. He sits in every Irish parliament from 1692, really, when the Irish parliament becomes an established feature of political life right through his death in 1711, and he never speaks once. And he's never a member of a committee. He's never actively involved in the world of Parliament. So he's not a political figure. He's a sort of mildly political figure in Armagh, in that he's involved in various local commissions and so on. But he never sets foot onto the national political stage. And he doesn't seem to be really interested in these high politics. So in other words, is he simply a provincial landowner? A planter, landlord, who got property as part of the plantation scheme. And if he is that, well, what makes him different from all those other people like Obans and so on around North Armagh, who also got plantation grants? Surely, we should simply treat them all the same. And part of the reason why Arthur Brownlow has a claim to our interest, and also why he is so interesting, comes about really because of a chance encounter of 1699, when a Welshman called Edward Fluid is in Dublin. Now, who is Edward Fluid? Edward Fluid is a Welsh scholar. In the late 17th century, people began to develop a fascination with language and how language works. And Fluid was one of those who was interested particularly in the Welsh language. And getting interested in the Welsh language, he started to ask the question, how is Welsh related to Irish? So he came to Ireland. And one of his first things that he tries to do is to collect Irish words to produce a book which will be essentially one of the very early Irish dictionaries in a thing called Archaeologia Britannica, which is published in 1707. Now, Edward Fluid is collecting these words, and he's particularly interested in old words as well, by looking at old manuscripts. And he wants not only to look at these old manuscripts, but in some occasions to buy these old manuscripts from people who no longer want them. After all, the world that had created those manuscripts, the world of Gaelic Ulster, had collapsed in the early part of the 17th century, more under social and economic pressures than under political pressures. So there were floating around in the countryside a lot of manuscripts which in the past had been owned by the learned classes in Ireland, which no longer had a function since those learned classes had disappeared. So these manuscripts are wandering, floating around the Irish countryside, and antiquarians like Fluid are buying them up. Now, Fluid was clearly in Dublin for quite some time, and he was asking around as to who had old Irish manuscripts that A, might be prepared to show them to him, and B, might even be prepared to sell them to him. And it seems that it's in Dublin that someone mentions to him the name of Arthur Brownlow. Now, Arthur Brownlow had not been known before as a collector of manuscripts. A couple of years earlier, a man called Nicholas Bernard had produced a listing of Irish manuscripts, known Irish manuscripts, in Ireland. And he listed all the big, well-known collections, but Arthur Brownlow's was not part of it. So clearly somebody told Fluid about this strange man, Arthur Brownlow, who had a collection of manuscripts, and Fluid set off hot foot to Lurgan.
he was travelling northwards anyway. He would later move up towards Lurgan. He would buy manuscripts from the Maynooth family, the learned family, poets who had fallen on hard times, and he would buy other manuscripts in Donegal. But he on his way, he visited Arthur Brownlow, and Brownlow showed him his collection of Irish language manuscripts, probably about a dozen. We know this because it includes Archaeologia Britannica, that book, which contains this very early dictionary of Irish. Fluid, like a proper scholar, listed his sources, and these sources included Arthur Brownlow's manuscripts. We think it's about a dozen manuscripts, although he does seem to have had an Irish grammar, which Fluid was shown, but Fluid, for some reason, did not include it in his list. So here's the enigma then that Edward Fluid had discovered. A settler landlord who was an MP, who was a pillar of the Dublin administration, whose estate and whose wealth rested on colonisation, who had been, or his father rather, had been burnt out of Lurgan by the native Irish. But this man showed a tremendous interest in the culture of these people, who he regards rightly with some suspicion, and certainly doesn't let them anywhere near his town of Lurgan, corralling them all in that area, of course, which we now know as the Munchies, up beside the lake. So Brownlow, therefore, was a curiosity, was an enigma in his time. A few years later, a man called Thomas Molyneux, who was connected to the famous Molyneux family of Dublin, the people who were involved in high politics, in political ideas, and also early science. Thomas Molyneux also went to visit Arthur Brownlow, and he called him a gentleman more curious than ordinary. So Brownlow, therefore, is a man who is curious, which is why he's an enigma. He's somebody we can't quite pin down. A settler with an interest in Gaelic manuscripts. A settler who clearly seems to be able to have been able to speak Irish, and not only speak Irish, but it is said, and we cannot be sure that it's actually true, that he was competent to translate an elegy on Owen O'Neill. Owen O'Neill, of course, the hero of the 1640s, of the Confederation in the 1640s, who had come from near there. So Arthur Brownlow is discovered in the 17th century as an enigma. How can we locate Arthur Brownlow? Who is he? Can we locate him in time and space? And might these provide us with a little bit of a clue as to why he was such an enigma to contemporaries? Well, of course, his family had come from Nottinghamshire as part of the plantation. His grandfather and his great-grandfather, John Brownlow, and Sir William Brownlow, as they would be, came to Ireland as part of the plantation scheme, and each got a grant of land around North Ireland. John, of course, his great-grandfather dies fairly quickly, and his father, Sir William, inherits the estate, so that he now has a very substantial estate indeed in the barony of Land in North Ireland. Sir William, as he will become, does something which was not unusual, but at the same time uncommon. That is, he married a Gaelic Irish woman, a woman called Eleanor O'Doherty. And Eleanor O'Doherty was a significant figure from County London. Now, the marriage produced 4 children, all of them girls, which was a bit unfortunate because it was normally sons who would inherit the property. So that there was a problem. The girls had to make appropriate marriages, and in particular, the eldest girl, Lettice, who was Arthur Brownlow's mother, was a very marriageable proposition. She married 4 times. She married, first of all, a man called Patrick Chamberlain. Then, in 1652, Patrick Chamberlain was Arthur Brownlow's father. Secondly, she married Christopher Clinton in 1652, then Alexander Aston in 1664, and finally Mr. Beaversham in 1668. Now, those names, in a way, provide us with a clue as to the world in which Arthur Brownlow grew up. His grandmother is Eleanor Doherty, an Irish woman from Derry. Patrick Chamberlain, his father, was an old English Catholic from a place called Miserave, which is not very far from Ardee in County Louth. And indeed, Arthur would, when he inherited the estate in Lurgan in 1660, when his grandfather died, he also inherited the Miserave estate. Admittedly, there were other charges on that estate, but over the late 17th century, Arthur would buy them out, so that he would have a substantial piece of property in North Louth, as well as his Armagh property. So Lettice marries first Patrick Chamberlain, an old English gentleman from the Pale, a Catholic, so that he is someone who, shall we say, would not belong to the traditional world of the settlement. Secondly, she marries Christopher Clinton. Christopher Clinton, New English settler, rather like the Brownlows themselves, as indeed is Alexander Ashton and Mr. Beaversham, the other 2 men she married. So you can see already that Arthur is growing up, or at least is being born into a world which is unusually diverse for him. In fact, it gets better. Because if we look at his aunts, 2 of his aunts, Rose and Eleanor, Lettice's sisters. One marries Captain William Draper, and Captain William Draper is a Cromwellian soldier in the 1640s. Eleanor marries a man called Fulton Martin, and Fulton Martin is a 1649 officer. That is, he is a royalist soldier in the 1640s. So Arthur is not just being brought up within the world of Catholicism and Protestantism, but he's also being brought up within lots of different varieties of settlers. Republicans, that is, people like William Draper, who fought for Cromwell, and royalists, such as Fulton Martin, who had fought for the king. So Arthur's being brought up in a remarkably diverse world, and indeed that will show itself right throughout the late 17th century. Because one of the things that's very striking about Arthur is how remarkably tolerant he is. In an age when most people were firmly of the view that the established church, the Church of Ireland, was a branch of the state, and not to give your allegiance to it was equivalent to treason, and to tolerate in the late 17th century what became known as dissenters, in other words, Quakers, independence, and other religious values was in fact a very dangerous thing. Arthur does precisely that. And if you compare, say, Lisburn under a man called George Rawdon, the agent of Conway's in Lisburn, he refuses to allow Quakers on his estate. He refuses to allow Presbyterians on his estate. And yet Arthur Brownlow allows both. As we know, the Quakers established themselves there from the 1650s, and indeed established a church or established a meeting there in the late 17th century. And again, the Presbyterians established themselves there in the late 17th century. So Arthur is remarkably, as a man of that age, he is remarkably tolerant. He's very clear about his own position. His own position is that he is a secular landlord who is a prominent figure in local county society. He himself is, without any doubt, Protestant. There is no doubt that Arthur is a loyal follower of the Belgian administration, but he is prepared to tolerate the other people around for very good reasons, as I hope that we'll see in a moment. So what you get, therefore, is Arthur, who is brought up in this world with sharing these diverse ideas, these diverse sentiments. In 1616, his grandfather, William, dies. He inherits the estate. What did Lurgan look like when he inherited? Well, it was a fairly small place. It had been burnt, or at least a substantial amount of burnt in the 1640s, so it had to be rebuilt. And there was a substantial bit of rebuilding in the 1650s, but it's really in the 1660s. It's really when Arthur comes into his own that you begin to see Lurgan flourishing. Now, Lurgan flourishes under the aegis of Brownlow. It's Brownlow who plans Lurgan. See this very clearly because the Brownlow lease book, which David mentioned earlier on, shows us Brownlow laying out the town, that this is to be an ordered town, this is to be a planned town, this is to be a town with, almost an intellectual town, not something that will grow up randomly. And this reflects, again, Arthur Brownlow's interest in something else. If we are looking for a word to describe Arthur Brownlow, it's probably the word improver. He has a very clear idea that he wants to improve the world, to make it better, to shape it. He's interested in different ways of doing that. One of the ways he's interested in is science. So, for example, he's very interested in the whole question of the idea of preserved wood in Loch Ness. He sticks a holly branch into the loch to see if it will be preserved. He tries experiments. In other words, Brownlow is a very early scientist in Lurgan. He's interested in the latest ideas. He's interested in the experiments. He's interested in trying out new things. And that goes as well, not just for holly branching, but he's interested in new economic experiments. One of the great economic experiments he introduces is the linen trade. The linen trade that Brownlow was responsible for. He sets up a market in Lurgan, offers to buy in all the linen that comes, and then how does he get it out? And this is why he's interested in people like the Quakers, because the Quakers provide him with a transnational network, buy and sell. So the Quaker merchants, such as Hook, are the people that he uses to sell all this linen that he buys in the market. So Brownlow is an improver. He's got an inquiry mind. He's interested in science. He's interested in economics. He's interested in building his new town according to the latest principles. And it's hardly surprising, given those two things, first of all, his very diverse background, that he should be exposed to all sorts of interesting ideas through these range of people that he's related to, from Eleanor Doherty, his grandmother,
through his father, Patrick Chamberlain, through his uncles, that they are involved with the whole range of things, that he should be interested in something else that is going on in his estate. And that is the circulation of manuscripts, in particular Irish language manuscripts. The thing which was commented on by Claude, that this is what this man is really interested in. Apparently he's going to talk to you about his manuscript collection and what sort of manuscript collection he managed to build up over the years as a result of this interest, this science, this inquiring mind, and this desire to improve the word.
Okay, so I'll take over here now for about 15 minutes. And in terms of talking about manuscripts that Brownlow collected, the first point to note is that if you wanted to read anything in Irish in the late 17th century, you were talking about reading a manuscript rather than a printed book. The word of print had begun to influence Irish society in the late 17th century, but the market was dominated by books in Latin and in English. And those books tended by and large to be printed in London or elsewhere, and they were destined originally for a market other than Ireland, but peddlers and book dealers would have distributed them locally throughout Ireland as well. But print was very rarely used to communicate through Irish prior to the middle of the 19th century. And so if somebody like Arthur Brownlow wanted to read about the history of his local area using authentic sources, well, then he had to be able to access manuscripts in the Irish language, and he needed either to learn to read them for himself or to have contact with a translator who could read them for him. So if a manuscript that you heard about and you knew about its contents was of interest to you, but you didn't actually own a copy or couldn't just go out and buy a copy, you could always commission a scribe to make a new copy for you. A kind of print on demand that's back in fashion nowadays. And we have at least one example of Arthur Brownlow doing exactly that, commissioning a scribe to write out a text for him. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But as Raymond mentioned, the reason that we know the kind of manuscripts that Arthur Brownlow had in the Irish language is because the Welsh antiquary Edward Llwyd wrote a list of manuscripts that were of interest to him in Brownlow's collection. Now, Edward Llwyd wouldn't have been bothered with manuscripts in Latin or in English or in other languages because, as Raymond mentioned, he was interested in Celtic languages, so he wanted to compare the Welsh language with the Irish language, and that's why he noted Arthur Brownlow's Irish manuscripts as opposed to anything else that was in his library, either in print or in manuscript. And as Raymond mentioned, Edward Llwyd was touring Ireland in 1699 and 1700, and he wanted to actually buy the manuscripts that people had if they no longer wanted them. And he bought manuscripts in County Antrim from an Owen O'Gnieve, who was a descendant of a hereditary family of poets and historians. He also went to County Leitrim, where he met a Tadhg O'Roddy, another manuscript collector, who had a large collection of manuscripts on legal topics. But O'Roddy, unlike O'Gnieve, wasn't prepared to sell them. Llwyd mentioned, having left O'Roddy in Leitrim empty-handed, Llwyd mentioned, the Irish have many more ancient manuscripts than we do in Wales, but since the late revolutions they are much lessened. I now and then pick up some very old parchment manuscripts, but they are very hard to come by. And he comments on the owners, they understand them and value them as their lives. So Tadhg O'Roddy didn't sell his manuscripts to Fluid, but O'Ruddy was different to Brownlow because O'Ruddy again came from a long line of Irish scholars, so it's not surprising that he didn't want to part with his manuscripts. It is more surprising that Arthur Brownlow had a collection of manuscripts in the Irish language. Fluid lists at least 12, there may have been more. Now, 12 isn't a huge library, but manuscripts were expensive things. They were luxury items in the 17th century. Whether you were buying them secondhand or whether you were commissioning somebody to write one out for you, they were never cheap. So 12 items was a respectable collection. Now, of that list, we do know, of the list that Fluid made, we do know that there were other items in the collection. The most important of these is one that some of you will be familiar with. This was a medieval vellum manuscript dating from the 8th century, known as the Book of Armagh. This was a gospel book containing a complete New Testament, but also the other thing it had that was unique to it was the earliest known examples of the words of St. Patrick's Confessio, and other related documents. The manuscript had been written in the year 807 in Armagh. Now that date makes it more or less contemporary with the much more famous Book of Kells. The manuscript hereditary keepers were still living in Armagh down to the late 17th century and treated it as a relic, which is why it survived all those decades. However, it was sold for £5 in the late 17th century, and soon after it was acquired by none other than Arthur Brownlow. When Fluid saw it in Brownlow's library in 1699 or 1700, he was told that the manuscript was said to have been written by St. Patrick himself. That was how much of a relic it was in the 17th century. It eventually passed Trinity College, Dublin, where it still remains. Manuscript 52 in Trinity's Manuscripts Department, if you're interested. Now, the Irish language manuscripts in Brownlow's collection were much, much later than that. And like all manuscripts written in the late 17th, early 18th centuries, they were written on paper rather than vellum. So it was a much more modern means of communication. The Irish language manuscripts that Brownlow had can be divided into three groups. The first were sources for the history of Ireland in general texts. Then there was a batch of material that was essentially local history or tales and stories that related to the Armagh region. And finally, there were a couple of miscellaneous items that defied classification, and he may have acquired them randomly or by accident rather than design. So the first two items on the list that we know that Brownlow had in his library were very well-known works. First of all, he owned a copy of Geoffrey Keating's History of Ireland, known as Foras Fasa Éireann, which translates as a compendium of knowledge about Ireland. It had been written in the 1630s in the Irish language in Munster. Its author was a Catholic priest of Anglo-Norman background from County Tipperary. He had been educated in France in the early years of the 17th century, and he returned to Ireland to work as a preacher in the province of Munster, and in his spare time he researched and wrote about early Irish history. Now, Keating's own background was Anglo-Norman, which is something he shared with Patrick Chamberlain of Nittlerath in County Louth, who was Arthur Brownlow's father. Keating's history had been written from a Catholic perspective, but by the late 17th century, it had become accepted as a standard history of Ireland because it was rooted in medieval manuscript sources. And it was of appeal to a lot of people because it was written in a very lively, interesting manner. So its success, as in terms of its intellectual content, had to do with the way it provided all people living on the island of Ireland, regardless of their origins. It provided all groups with a story of the Irish past that integrated them into one master narrative, so that they could all feel that it was part of their origin legend, the story of ancient Ireland, and where the various groups that had come to the island over the centuries and millennia could fit in. So by the late 17th century, Keating's History of Ireland was a standard work. It had been translated into Latin in the mid-17th century. There were, at least that we know about now, 4 different translations into English before the end of the 17th century, all circulating in manuscript. But we know that the copy that Arthur Brownlow had was in the Irish language. And the Irish language versions of this history are by far the most numerous that survive in archives today. Now, Arthur Brownlow was not the only person in Lurgan interested in that history of Ireland. We know that there was a Quaker teacher from Scotland who was living as a tenant in a house in the town of Lurgan in the 1670s and 1680s, who commissioned a copy of Keating's Forest Fassa in 1696. Now, we know that the scribe who Patrick Logan, the Quaker teacher, commissioned was a James Gribben. And it's possible there are 2 different men called Gribben who are tenants on the Brownlow estate, one of them in the town of Lurgan and one a few miles outside. And so the young James Gribben, who was commissioned to write this manuscript, could have been related to one or other of those. We don't know for certain, but it seems very likely that this Quaker teacher probably borrowed Arthur Brownlow's copy of Forest Fassa Éireann to give to the scribe to make a copy. We can't be certain, but it's quite likely. Let's put it like that. Now, the other historical manuscript of general interest that Brownlow had was the Book of Invasions, the Lurgan Éireann, as it was known. Now, this was again a medieval origin legend that kept getting rewritten and revised through the centuries. The version that Arthur Brownlow had was one that had been revised in the early 17th century in Liscool, County Fermanagh, by a team of historians who later compiled the Annals of the Four Masters. The Book of Invasions described the waves of settlers that had come to the island of Ireland in prehistoric times, the Tuatha De Danann and ultimately the Clan Amelia, who settled on the island. So it was a standard origin legend in the Irish people, and it was widely known in Brownlow's day. So Brownlow and his contemporaries would have regarded it, we now regard it as mythical, but they would have regarded it as probably plausible history. Now, so those are 2 standard works that Brownlow had in his library. The second category is about 9 items. There were probably in 9 separate manuscripts. And these are much more local in that they relate to Brownlow's immediate environment in North Armagh, and numerically they dominate the collection. The description given by Edward Fluid, and this is all we have to go on as where we start when we're doing research on Brownlow and his manuscripts. This is what Fluid says: a copy of the Laur Ónach, then 3 books of miscellanies containing several ancient poems or dawn and some fragments of history and chronology, so it's a bit vague, right? Cach Múlana, which is a romance, Buile Hivna, Corric Ferdi agus Concolin, Cach Cower, Cach Gowra, Cach Cudda, Cach Ahabo, and Cach Oliver. So various romantic tales. So that's the evidence that we have to go on. So I'm not going to work through all of those, but we're going to look at some of them so that you get an idea of the kind of material that Brownlow had in his collection. So the Leabhar Ónach contains historical material, mainly genealogical, on the O'Neills of Ulster, and traces their story back through the centuries to Niall of the Nine Hostages, reputed to have lived in the 5th century AD. Now, as you know, the O'Neills had once occupied the land that the Brownlow family acquired in County Armagh, and thus the Leabhar Ónach shed light on the kind of society that had existed in County Armagh in earlier times, and explained the ongoing esteem and reputation of the descendants of the O'Neills right down to the late 17th century. Now, the text survives in Royal Irish Academy manuscript 24p33. And the text has been edited and published as long ago as 1931 in an edition of the Leabhar Clanna Éabhuí, the Book of the O'Neills of Clandeboy. The same manuscript, Academy Manuscript 24p33, also contains a significant collection of poetry relating to the Ulster chiefs, most prominently the O'Neills of Clandeboy. The poems had been composed over several generations, mostly in the 17th century, and were put together for Cormac O'Neill in the 1680s. Now, this Book of the O'Neills of Clandeboy is probably to be identified as one of the manuscript miscellanies that Edward Lewis saw in Brownlow's library. The manuscript has an inscription in Irish in Arthur Brownlow's own hand. So it's pretty definitive evidence that he had that. On the 1st of August, 1689, Brownlow wrote on that manuscript, Eg seo Leabhar Arthur Brownlow no Mac Arthur, and Céad Law David na Lumasa sé Deagach the name. So it says, this is the book of Arthur Brownlow or Mac Arthur, which is a rendering of the surname Chamberlain, 1st of August 1689. Now, another book of miscellanies has the name William Brownlow on the 2nd page. This also survives in the Royal Irish Academy. It's manuscript 24p13. And I'm pretty sure that the William Brownlow signature there is Arthur's son rather than his grandfather. This manuscript 24p13 in the Academy was written in 1621 by a scribe called Lurgan for Niall King. King was the patron that commissioned it, right? It contains poetry, a genealogical tract, a list of kings, and a version of the medieval tract on Irish place lore that works through place names in poetic form and with prose explanations, explaining topographical features in the landscape by telling stories about them. It also contained a version of a medieval text called Cor Anman. This was a handbook explaining medieval personal names and the characters featured in Irish mythology and Irish literature. Now that text also incorporated a version of the Book of Invasions, the Leabhar Gabhála. Now, in the late 19th century, these two composite manuscripts that I've mentioned, dating from the 17th century, came into the possession from the Brownlow family, came into the possession of Reverend Maxwell Close, a Church of England clergyman who was based in Ireland. And he sold them on to William Reeves, who was the Church of Ireland Bishop of Down and Connor. Now, Reeves was an interesting man as well, and he was another manuscript collector. He was a former keeper of Armagh Public Library, now better known as the Robinson Library in Armagh. William Reeves sold his manuscripts in 1892 to the Royal Irish Academy, and so the two composite manuscripts that incorporate quite a number of different texts ended up in the Royal Irish Academy Library in Dublin, where they still are. Now, Arthur Brownlow, as we know from Clúid's list, also copied various other Irish tales. Some of them were not just random, they had specific Lurgan or County Armagh associations. For example, he commissioned a tale called Cach Moilana, the Battle of Moilana, and he paid Padraig Mac Ogenon to transcribe it in 1685. So it wasn't just a random acquisition, it's something he actually wanted to own. The manuscript he commissioned, again, is now in the Royal Irish Academy. It's manuscript 24L36. And it tells the tale of the rivalry between Ulster, the northern half of Ireland, Lough Quinn, and the southern half of Ireland, Lough Moe, and the battles that took place in medieval times, resulting in the triumph of the Northerners. So it was a success story for the northern half of Ireland, and that may be why Brownlow was interested in it. The next tale was a tale of Buile Sivna that I mentioned earlier, where the central character, Sivna, was a local king whose territory incorporated the Lagan Valley and much of North Down. It told the story of, supposedly set in the 7th century, where the king went mad and he has adventures all over Ireland before his sanity is eventually restored. And it's the fact that it was based in the Lagan Valley area that was probably Brownlow's interest in that. There was another one, the tale of Cuchulainn and Ferdia, from the Ulster cycle of tales, focusing on Owen Macha, which is Navan Fort outside Armagh, when that was a centre of power for the whole island of Ireland. So again, it was depicting Brownlow's home area as the centre of the Kingdom of Ireland in medieval times. So Brownlow, again, had an interest, it would seem, in these kind of heroic tales that were focused on Armagh. I'm not going to go through all the other various stories of battles that he collected also, because for the remainder of them, we haven't managed to track down the exact manuscript that Brownlow owned. So we can only speculate about precisely what these texts were and why Brownlow had them. But you get the idea that he was interested in the general history of Ireland, and then he was interested in literary and historical texts that shed light on his own area, and he was interested in the Book of Armagh, probably because of its association with St. Patrick, containing texts relating to Patrick and to medieval Latin lives of St. Patrick. So then the final few items that I just mentioned briefly are much more random. Brownlow owned a medical manuscript, and we know this because people in the 17th century didn't have large number of notebooks or free bits of paper to write on, so they tended to scribble on any manuscript they happened to own. And one manuscript survives with a note on the fly leaf which reads, James O'Shiel, married to Elizabeth Brownlow, the 12th of March in the year 1673. And that's written in on a medical manuscript, so it's got nothing to do with it. But perhaps Brownlow just acquired it from that medical family just through a marriage link. There's also a very ancient treatise on geography listed by Clwyd, which could well be the version of the Din Hanachas, the place lore, that turns up in Academy Manuscript 24P13 that I already mentioned. And finally, as Raymond mentioned earlier, the last item that I'm going to mention is a poem, an elegy for Owen Roe O'Neill, who died in 1649, a military leader from the mid-17th century. And it's said that Arthur Brownlow translated this into English. Now, why would he be interested in O'Neill? It's because he was a military leader in the local area, and it seems to be his interest in local history essentially was the reason why he would have commissioned that. So when viewed as a collection, it's of modest enough proportions, but you get the idea that he was assembling manuscripts that he was interested in for various reasons to do with trying to understand the place that he was living by referring to much older sources about the kind of people that had lived there in decades, centuries, and even millennia before he came to live in Lurgan in County Armagh. Okay, I'll hand back to Raymond now.
Okay, so we have this picture then of this man, Arthur Brownlow, growing up in the Pale, in an Irish-speaking area, North Louth in the late 17th century, of being exposed to all these influences, royalist influences, Republican influences, influences from the Old English of the Pale, the Anglo-Irish, and indeed from the New English settlers that he was very much part of that community. And we've stressed his curiosity, his interest that leads him into this world of Irish manuscripts which are available locally and which are circulating locally, and which he starts to pick up and look at and be interested in because they tell him something of where he is. So how typical is he? Is Arthur Brownlow just a very unusual man? Or is he very typical of what's going on in the wider world? Is he, as Thomas Molyneux would describe, more curious than ordinary? In other words, is he simply odd? Well, I'd like to suggest to you that no, he's not. In fact, he's very typical. It just so happens that in his case, some of these broader, more general trends come out in other ways, because there are broader and more general trends happening in late 17th century Ulster that Brownlow fits into very nicely. First thing I think that is worth pointing out is that in the late 17th century and into the very early 18th century in Ulster, owning a library of manuscripts was not an unusual thing. As Bernie said, printed books are not all that common. We don't get a printing press in Belfast until the 1690s. So that people are reliant on manuscripts, and people do build up libraries of manuscripts, and we know of a number of these. We know, for example, in Fermanagh, Castle Cole, when it's rebuilt in the early 18th century, actually has a physical library built in. And we also know that Madden, last settler in Fermanagh, has an enormous manuscript collection, very important manuscript collection, most of which ends up in Trinity College Dublin. So the idea of owning a library, owning a collection of manuscripts is not unusual. And Brownlow in that case simply fits into, we don't know what printed books he may have owned, but certainly he owned a number of manuscripts, and lots of people, lots of settlers have done this. Second thing, so he's not untypical in building up a collection of manuscripts. The second thing is that he's not untypical in his interest in history, and in particular his history of the localities. When you think back, this isn't unusual because families like the Brownlows, by the 1660s, had been in Ireland for quite a long time. Arthur, for example, is fourth generation as a Brownlow in Armagh. So he's a fourth generation Brownlow. So he's by this stage, by the 1660s, many of those who had come over in the very early stages of the plantation are beginning to lose their interest in where they came from, whether it be Scotland or whether it be England. Now, it matters less to them than where they are living now. And they're beginning to show an interest in the history of their own particular branch of the family. And they have been cut off increasingly from England. One of the very important things which happened, of course, was the War of the 1640s. And what the War of the 1640s had done was force families which theatre of war they wished to fight in. Ireland, England, Scotland. The Brownlows had chosen to stay in Ireland, and indeed, the same thing would happen again in the 1680s with James II. When James II comes to power, what will happen to the Irish Protestants? And many of them, including Brownlow, opt to stay in Ireland. Others go off, for example, to the Alman, which is neutral during the wars, or they go off to England because they perceive it safe there. But the Brownlows always stay in Ireland.
and lots of other settler families as well. So they're having an identification with Ireland. And they talk about this. They begin to talk about themselves. The Brownlows begin to talk about themselves, not as Englishmen in Ireland, which is how they talked about themselves in the early part of the century, but they begin to talk about themselves as Anglo-Irish. Or if you're the Scots, Scots-Irish. So they begin to have an identification with Ireland. They begin to write histories. Some of those histories are very well known. The Montgomerys, for example, in North Down, write a history of their family. That's that text that we know as the Montgomery manuscripts. The Hamiltons do exactly the same. Viscount Clandeboy in North Down is the text known as the Hamilton manuscripts. The MacDonalds of Antrim, which of course had been Scottish from the Isles, who had settled in North Antrim, also write a history of the MacDonalds at the same time. So this interest in writing family history, and this family history is not new. The aim of this family history is to make a point. That is, we are not settlers. We are part of this world. We have settled in this world, and we have now become part of it. We have a lineage, we have a history. And that this is exactly what Brownlow is doing. He's doing exactly what they did in North Down. They're doing exactly what they did in County Antrim. And indeed, if you go down into Leitrim or Fermanagh, they're doing exactly the same thing. That early 18th century history, Macquarie and Fermanagh, is about exactly the same sort of thing. It's about establishing settler families in the world of the late 17th century, integrating them into local Irish society. And this, of course, was not something new in Ireland. Bernie talked about the text known as the Lacawalla, which interpreted the history of Ireland as a history of a series of invasions. And indeed, this is what Keating uses as the basis of his Forest Area, that the history of the Irish population was a series of invasions, one after the other, which were drawn into the local society and became localized in Ireland. They became Irish people. And of course, as far as Keating was concerned, the last of those great invasions was the Anglo-Norman invasion, his own people, and Arthur Chamberlain's people as well. So that you could see how this text would appeal to Brownlow. It told him the story of how these people had settled in exactly the same way as his family had settled in North Armagh, and how they had been nipped into Irish society to become proper Anglo-Irish gentlemen, supporters of the new order. So perhaps Molyneux was right, that he was at one level a gentleman more curious than ordinary. He was curious in the way his interest manifested itself in the Gaelic manuscripts, but he was not curious for having that interest, that curiosity about the wider world, about the world he lived in, about trying to improve his own world, about trying to discover how that world worked in early science. All these are part of the package, which is Arthur Brownlow, who is one of the most interesting and complex men that you could possibly discover in late 17th century Ireland. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Raymond, and Bernadette as well. I know you're off screen there somewhere, I'm assuming. So, yeah, that was fascinating, and it's amazing these manuscripts. Just even finding out about them, and that they exist, and I assume that they're held in the Royal Irish Academy. Would that be right?
Yes, insofar as I've been able to find any Brownlow manuscripts, they all happen to be in the Academy, and it's really because when those manuscripts came on the market in the 19th century, there was no national library, and so members of the Academy privately bought up the kind of manuscripts that came on the market, and Brownlow's manuscripts seem to have been among those that were dispersed in the early 19th century, and various local collectors bought them and eventually sold them on to the Academy. So yes, so we have several. So whenever this lockdown is all over and people can come back and visit the Royal Irish Academy Library in Dublin, we can put them on display at some time in the future, hopefully.
Okay, that's excellent. And are there transcriptions of them available? For those
some of them, yes. One of them, the Book of the Unease of Clandeboy that I mentioned, that has been digitized and it can be seen online on the Irish Script on Screen website, which is isos.dias.ie. That's for Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies website. So it can be seen there. And it has also been transcribed and published by the Irish Manuscripts Commission back in 1931. And they have digitized all their out-of-print publications. So that's online on the Irish Manuscripts.ie website.
Okay, that's excellent to know. Sorry, I'm just making my own notes here as well as we're going. And that's interesting. And I have to say, Raymond, I'm a bit disappointed. I thought I liked that, the more curious and ordinary. I thought that was like Arthur Brownlow, but he's sort of curious, but not really curious. So, well, I think that's everything. I think that was a good afternoon. Thank you for choosing to spend it with us. And I'll like to wish you all a good afternoon and indeed a good evening. Thank you very much.